Unknown cases are often found by the family physician in the course of physical examinations, and among young people by tuberculin testing in the schools. If people are made aware of the value of periodic chest X-ray, the TB discovered will usually be in the early stage. If, however, TB is not looked for until the patient displays symptoms of the disease, the cases found are apt to be in the far advanced state when cure is uncertain and costly. The association may be called upon to furnish X-ray equipment, X-ray film, or technical and clerical services until such time as the health department can take over the responsibility. Since TB control depends on finding unknown and unsuspected cases, a program to wipe out the disease must strive to X-ray every adult in the community. To do this,
luckily for Roy, there's a first-rate sanatorium in every town. Blood from the mouth, the physician knows, is not to be passed up lightly. Experienced hands, skilled eyes and ears track down the cause of that hemorrhage. Get the facts together, all the odds and ends of facts. Sputum and blood samples are taken, and off they go to the laboratory. And very important, the magic eye of the X-ray. Only a shadow picture is produced, but the trained eye can read what's behind those shadows as clearly as you read the page of a book. The sputum sample is put through a rigid test. The microscope aids. The germ unmistakable. To the medical staff, these facts spell tuberculosis of the left lung, active, far advanced, and with a cavity. But if Roy plays the game, his chances are good. Treatment, absolute bed rest. And, says the chief of staff, bring this case up for review in 1 month. Tuberculosis certainly changes Roy's life. It puts a sudden stop to work and play and plans for the future. Rest and more rest. Rest tuberculosis germs. Don't delay, Julie. Let the doctor decide. And Julie visits her physician. Besides a routine examination of the chest, the examination includes the tuberculin test, a simple skin test which tells whether tuberculosis germs have found a foothold in the body. Up-to-date physicians everywhere now use this test. If negative, it means no tuberculosis. If positive, it means search further. Julie returns. The test is positive. The spot where the solution was injected is slightly raised and reddish. Julie must be X-rayed. Here are the shadows. Expertly interpreted by her doctor, they say, early tuberculosis. Don't delay, Julie. The sooner treatment is begun, the more certain the cure. Bed rest now for Julie. Almost a vegetable existence, this, but we...
Hello, I'm Dr. Rick Ervin from the South Carolina Tuberculosis Program. I'm going to present a few personal reflections concerning tuberculosis and my family. Could I have my next slide, please? A case presentation. Very briefly, a 74-year-old man was newly diagnosed with agnogenic myeloid metaplasia, myelofibrosis, and cytopenias. His skin test was markedly positive. His TB history revealed, quote, "I remember a girl at school sitting behind me coughing all the time, and she did not return the next year. Never before, never since then have I wanted a patient to have tuberculosis more than this one, because this was my father." Reevaluation of marrow showed no granulomas, negative special stains, and the culture ultimately was AFP negative. He unfortunately succumbed with TB infection, but no disease. Next slide, please. 1910 census, when I was doing genealogy, showed that as a toddler, he was living with his parents and his great aunt Margaret. I found that in 1879, her husband died from consumption. In 1880, her cousin died from consumption of the lungs. In 1886, her daughter died from phthisis pulmonalis. In 1908, her son died from consumption. And in 1906, her grandson died from diphtheria. Infectious diseases were a part of life a century ago. And at this point in time, we are very fortunate. Next slide, please. I was able to obtain some death certificates, and it really hit home. This young woman, only 19 years of age, died within a stone's throw from where I grew up in Philadelphia. Next slide, please. From the book we're discussing today, I come across a quotation. Instead of endorsing a link between the human and bovine diseases, Koch's language went the other way until it dawned on the crowd that Koch, remarkably, was outright denying any connection between the two diseases. But they were undoubtedly the same disease, von Behring stated, insisting that most cases of pulmonary tuberculosis in childhood came from infected milk. Alas, it seemed clear that Koch was absolutely and outrageously wrong. The microbe the American and British groups reported was the same in both humans and cows. Next slide. By that point in time, the country went through a national tuberculosis eradication program in 1917, such that over the next 5 years, infected cattle were isolated and culled from the herds. It was well appreciated by the folks in this country that tuberculosis in milk was related. Next slide, please. Here's my dad in the mid-30s with one of his milk delivery trucks. He and his father developed a dairy there in West Philadelphia at the time. So tuberculosis and its association with milk was so well known there that Dad was actually able to use tuberculin-tested milk as an advertisement on how good the milk was. Next slide, please. This sort of sign concerning no smoking and no spitting was common in most major cities. And I still remember such signs on the subways in Philadelphia in the 50s and 60s when I was growing up. Next slide, please. And here's a picture of my Crumbine brick, designed by legendary Kansas public health physician Samuel J. Crumbine. These bricks were produced as a reminder to the people walking on them to not spit. Crumbine, interestingly, is also credited with inventing the Dixie cup to replace the common drinking cup then in wide use. Next slide, and that's the end. So now it's my pleasure to turn the podium over to my colleague in Florida, Dr. Dave Ashkin. Dave, if you could take it from here.
Dr. Ervin, thank you so much. I want to welcome everybody to World TB Day 2022. And, we were just saying before, how do you describe World TB Day? It's really a day, that for us who do TB, I think recognizes the importance of our work. It was in 1882 on this day, March 24th, 140 years ago, that Robert Koch announced that he had found what had caused tuberculosis. And it was during that announcement that people really, all these millions of people, hundreds of thousands who were afflicted by the disease, millions who had died, really had that hope that maybe someday they would have a cure, a remedy. And for the next 140 years, we all have dedicated our lives to try to further that goal. And that's what today is about. Today is about, a goal, a dream that someday we won't have to have World TB Day anymore. A dream that we may, thanks to the work we do and the seeds we plant today, we'll be able to once and for all eradicate this disease. And we're progressing, but we're not there yet. And today is the day to remind everybody, our colleagues, our citizens, our friends, our neighbors, that TB is still a real problem. A matter of fact, that as you're aware, TB up until last year was the leading cause of death from any single infection. When I say last year, I think that World TB Day has a different feeling. I've been doing World TB Day for 30 years, and I don't think, as much as I used to say, I don't think I ever appreciated what a disease can mean to a society. And over these last 2 years, I don't think it's ever been more apparent. And that's where I want to bring today and why we decided to do what we did today. I actually started, I've been a fan of history of TB forever. As a matter of fact, my colleague who's joining us today at A.G. Holly Hospital, Dave Roach was our CEO, and we used to, after a hard day, we used to sit down and talk and swap stories of the history. And we talked about books we had read, The White Plague by Dubois. We talked about The Forgotten Plague by Frank Ryan and Time Bomb by Lee Reichman, our colleague. And a couple of years ago, I heard about a book called The Remedy. And it was by a gentleman by Thomas Goetz. And, I'd gotten to the point that I thought for sure that when I read books about tuberculosis, I had known it all, I'd read it all, but it really changed me. And this book really brought TB to life and really kind of brought the personalities and the struggles and the meanings to life. And I, at that time, had this wild idea. I said, hey, maybe we should bring Thomas to speak to our community. But then something happened, and that was COVID. And everything got kind of put on hold. And during COVID, I learned something that I really appreciated is the history matters. The history really matters. And we need to learn from our history. And there's a lot that history can teach us. And when things start to calm down, I had this bizarre idea again. And all of us did is, why don't we ask Thomas to join us? And the wildest part is we called him, we asked him, and he said yes. And what we wanted to do today is take today and remember our past, remember where we've been, and hopefully that will help guide us in our future, especially as we're living through a pandemic. And I have the distinct honor to introduce Thomas Goetz. I heard him on the TED Talk. If you ever have a minute to listen, it's fantastic. And he's a very special person. We are so honored that he wrote about TB and brought it to life. He has an interesting past. He's a journalist. He's an author and entrepreneur. He uses data, design, and stories to help people understand and navigate complicated issues in their lives. He's the co-founder of Iodine, an award-winning website that helps people make sense of their health and medicines. In 2016, Iodine was acquired by GoodRx. We're seeing their commercials all the time. It's America's leading source of prescription drug savings, where he presently serves as chief of research. Thomas was previously the executive director of Wired. For all of us techies, we loved it and we followed it. He led a dozen national magazine. He had received a dozen national magazine awards in his many years, and he wrote dozens of cover stories on technology, science, and medicine. He began his career as a reporter at the Village Voice in the Village in New York City, my old haunting grounds, and he also worked for the Wall Street Journal. He'd written for the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and Bon Appetit. His writing has been repeatedly selected for the Best American Science Writing and Best Technology Writing anthologies. He served as the first entrepreneur in residence for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where he founded Flip the Clinic, and RWJ's signature program working to transform the practitioner-patient encounter. His 2010 TED Talk, which I highly recommend you guys watch, he talked on visualizing medical data so it could be utilized and encouraged patients' adherence and the way clinicians approach patients. And it's been viewed more than 500,000 times. He holds an MPH from the UC Berkeley and an MA in literature from the University of UVA. And with no further delay, I want to introduce, he told me I can say this, my friend, he knows me now, he said, Mr. Thomas Goetz. Thomas, thank you so much for doing this for us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashkin. It's embarrassing to hear yourself talked about like that. For me, it was a huge honor. I feel like, everyone on this call, I admire and put so much faith and just so impressed by the work that the public health community does. And part of what I regard as my job is to tell the stories of your work and the impact that public health has to the world. I'm somewhat of an unorthodox member of the public health tribe. I got as Dr. Ashkin said, I got my master's in public health in 2007 at Berkeley, really in honor of my sister Cecilia, who died doing public health work in Uganda back in 1998. And for me, I also come from a broader family of medicine and public health. My father was an endocrinologist and an epidemiologist. My mother was a public health nurse in New York City and later in Minneapolis, where I grew up. And then my sister is a surgeon and also, more importantly, has a degree in public health. And she may be on this call. I sent her the link. So, but anyway, so for me, public health was really just meant to be a ride along with my work in journalism. But it was, and I've been fortunate to kind of fuse the two. But really, public health has been the kind of unexpected beacon in my life and has shined light onto new ideas, new opportunities. And as I say, I'm just proud to be an advocate and an evangelist for public health now for 15 years. And especially these days, I think it's so important to be reminded that all the things that public health does for our society. So before I get into the big stuff, let me start sharing. And this is where I say, can you see my screen?
And we can see your screen, Thomas.
All right. So before I get into the big stuff, where I want to draw, as this slide says, some parallels between tuberculosis in the 19th century and pandemic disease in the 21st century, let me just explain briefly how the book came to be. It started with amazing writer Burton Rouchet, who some public health nerds on this call might know of his work. He was an amazing writer for The New Yorker in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And really, he wrote along with the New York City Department of Public Health on these mysteries that happened. And it was this book and his work were family favorites in my house in Minnesota, alongside Arthur Conan Doyle. We just ate them up. And so in 2005, the New England Journal of Medicine, this says 2015, but it was actually 2005 issue, that the New England Journal of Medicine did a one-page essay in tribute to Burton Rouchet. And so my dad sent me the issue. He was a lifelong subscriber. The next page had this other little essay, a one-page essay, about another medical mystery, which was just kind of touched on the story between these two men, Robert Koch and Arthur Conan Doyle. And the story, of course, was that there was this kind of almost meeting between Robert Koch and Conan Doyle, where Conan Doyle was just beginning. He was a medical doctor in England, and was just beginning to start writing what we now know him for as the author of Sherlock Holmes stories, but he wasn't famous for those yet. And so he heard that Koch was giving this demonstration in Berlin on his what was called a remedy. And Koch, of course, was also trained as a physician, but had in the previous decade become quite a leading, if not one of the most famous scientists in the world. And so this news shook up the world. So this was as I say, a little essay. And as reading it, I was captivated and immediately thought, this is a book. There's a book here. It was a story of historical characters. It was a story of science. It was nothing less than the story of the birth of modern medicine and public health. So as a writer, once you get an idea that there's a story in it, you immediately start to think that there's competition out there and somebody else was going to get to it first. So pretty quickly within the next, it was 2005. So it took me 5, 7, almost 9 years to finally publish the book. But it was really that one page essay that sparked it. But as I began writing the story or the book, I realized that it's actually there are more complicated ideas at work as well, and 3 themes that I wanted to touch on today that I think, as I say, really resonate how the history of tuberculosis in particular resonates with our current moment with another pathogen transforming our lives. So let me share those. The first thing that the 21st century could learn from the 19th century is that science is invisible, usually invisible. We expect a lot from medicine, but life gets in the way and we don't necessarily think about science. And when I should be clear, when I say science here, I am absolutely inclusive of public health. I'm talking largely about medical science, but thinking of public health as the application of that science to the world. So when I say science, it's a shorthand in this context to this audience, especially for public health. So what do I mean by science is invisible? Well, in that kind of 18th century, 19th century, as Dr. Ervin said at the beginning, and I loved his comments and was so struck by some of the observations he was making, the banality of death, the commonness of death, the ubiquity of death was something we really have no way to process today, except of the last couple of years. But largely, our modern life does not experience death on a scale that it did then. Something like the calculations I made showed that the death rate was 4 times higher among humanity, Western countries, than it is today, 4 times higher. And that's not just child mortality. That was across all age groups. So the child mortality was 20 times higher, if I did the math right. But the other age groups were clearly still 3-4 times higher than today. And what that means is there was just this kind of pall of death, and science, medical science as it existed, was invisible because it didn't do much. It was largely useless for human health. In fact, medicine, my friend and another writer, Stephen Johnson, made this great argument in his recent book called Extra Life. Medicine was in fact dangerous to your health. You could just ask George Washington, who died of bloodletting, and he had the best medical care one could find in the country. Surgery was more fatal oftentimes than the injuries. On the battlefield, fatalities from infection were more common than war. There really was nothing good that science could do for people. And so people didn't think about it. People didn't expect much from it. It was also invisible quite literally, because when bacteria started to emerge, you could only see them in a microscope, and then to show them to the world, you could only draw them. And these were the first drawings of Robert Koch of anthrax bacteria, the first discovery that he had that kind of established his process. So he had to use ink and paper to show these discoveries to the world. And over the course of the next few years, he worked with the Carl Zeiss company to invent microphotography to finally make the scientific world visible and tangible. And that kind of act, those heroics that he kind of created by making the invisible world visible. This was a illustration when in 1882 he actually identified the TB bacteria or bacilli. And in his hand, I think you can see it is his weapon of the microscope. But he also had the process and his postulates. that kind of process was what made science visible, and he connected cause and effect. And suddenly there was the hope or promise that science could help. Now, hygiene, of course, was the true discovery. The very existence of germs and the knowledge of germs became the cure. It took decades for the first real remedy to emerge. But by making it visible, that was a transformative moment. Of course, in the next few decades, we became inured or bored with medicine, and we've taken it for granted, and it became largely invisible again, right? The death rate plummeted. We didn't think about infectious disease. Medicine had nicely given us lots of treatments and sometimes outright cures for most diseases. They may not have been protected, but they were there, and so science has been largely invisible, yet again protecting us without us thinking about it. We take it for granted until something like a pandemic happens. This was the famous cover of the New York Times on May 24th in 2020, when the US reached 100,000 deaths. Now we're at 10 times that morbid milestone. And I think, it's again, almost at the point where it's becoming so, the mortality has become so ubiquitous and so evident everywhere that in some sense we're in denial again about the risks and the benefits and the causes and effects. It's something we're struggling with as a society, which you all deal with every day. So that takes me to my second thing we should learn, which is that science is ultimately social. The story of science is really science as a cultural force. How science exists inside society, how it reflects society, sometimes conflicts and upends the norms of society. But it's only in the context of people and human relationships and human beliefs and understanding that science exists. Now in public health, everyone in public health knows that, right? You all live that every day, from reckoning with the social determinants of health, to navigating the politics and the policies to further our public health. So you are the rare breed that understands that science is social. But of course, many people in medicine and health and science, and some even in public health, assume that truth will win out, right? That rationality will prevail, that evidence is everything. And I think one of the things we saw in the 19th century and have been reminded in the 21st century is that that's not always true. The public must be convinced. They must be cajoled. So one of my favorite ways of thinking about this is this quote from Francis Darwin, which says that in science, the credit goes to the man or woman who convinces the world, not to the one who the idea first occurs. And that was especially important when it came to the germ theory. Louis Pasteur had his bell jar experiments a decade or more before Robert Koch went in with his microscope and took on anthrax. And Pasteur had definitely, the idea of germ theory definitely existed. It existed for decades before Koch. But Koch, with his stereotypically German diligence, he invented, not just did he see those microbes, but he invented the process and the body of evidence and the methodology by which he could convince first his peers and then doubters, Virchow and others who doubted in the germ theory could not walk away from the evidence presented to them. And then in time, the public, he was able to convince the public. He was able to get, newspapers doing illustrations with him on the white horse. Not a lot of scientists get that kind of treatment these days. But he was able to convince the public, and he was able to sell the idea of germ theory to the public in a way that it started to resonate and started, as I say, to upend the norms of society. It was a revolutionary idea, as we all know and we're all reminded. It changed so much about humans understood our communities and our bodies and our health. But not everyone was convinced. The germ theory, of course, ran smack into a 19th century reactionary movement against government mandates and public health mandates. There were immunization laws passed in England and other countries to require vaccination. Science was often, as I say, it wasn't perceived, medical science, as doing a lot for people. In fact, it was more associated with things like grave robbing and animal experiments and quackery than actual benefit. And so, in some sense, a very rational scientific fear existed. Because what good did science do? What did medicine do? What benefit did it bring? It was a huge assumption, or a huge kind of intrusion, I should say, on people's everyday life. This kind of this notion of public health and government mandates, rules, asking people to change their lives and change how they treated, in some sense, to dictate how they treated their children, their families. And so a lot of people, many people were incredibly skeptical. And so there were anti-vaccination leagues that were really incredibly powerful political organizations that flourished throughout United States, throughout England, throughout Europe. Again, because why should they believe these so-called experts? It wasn't, I think, until Koch and even people like Sherlock Holmes, or people like Conan Doyle, through characters like Sherlock Holmes, started to make the argument, or make it evident, that science was changing everyday life. That I think this kind of wave of skepticism started to fall to the wayside, or become a marginal thought. And it was part because towards the end of the 19th century, there was this explosion of scientific and technological innovation. In some sense, it makes our current moment of high technology and the internet look positively analog. But if you look at this kind of period of 25, 30 years, you had all these inventions, which were amazing technologies. We think about the telephone and the light bulb as fairly banal, but in fact, they were transformative technologies that harnessed the power of electricity and communication that changed everyday life. So you have things like obviously the telephone and the automobile, but you also had the zipper and toilet paper, things that really made people behave very differently and offered benefits that were tangible in everyday. The vacuum cleaner, the washing machine, these things transformed everyday life. They transformed the roles in households. And alongside those, you started to have this trickle of discoveries that actually in medicine that actually did start to affect everyday people. So these first vaccines that emerged, largely because of Pasteur, not Koch. But then a few years later, X-rays, the first medicines like aspirin that actually proved beneficial and had scientific benefit. So you started to have this social impact of science, and modern medicine was absolutely a part of that. But that kind of that suspicion or hostility still lingered. Not everyone was convinced. Not everyone felt the need to buy in 100%. I think we've seen then as now that society, in society, many people are perfectly willing to be selfish. We can take the benefit without buying in. We can satisfy or improve our lives in ways that don't necessarily require. We're happy with cognitive dissonance. That's one thing we've seen again and again. So this anti-science strain has stayed visible, and I think one of the most exemplary illustrations of this is the kind of battles over fluoridation that we've had in the last few years. This fluoridation started in the 1940s. It was, I believe, Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1945 that first fluoridated its water supply. But what you've seen is this incredible hostility or reluctance to inject a chemical into the water people drink every day. Again, it seems there's you can understand the hesitation, but then science comes and says, we have the evidence, it's safe, it's beneficial. And, 50, 70 years on, you have 200 million Americans drink fluoridated water every day. Yet it's still controversial. In recent years, in fact, many communities across the United States and across the world have started to vote to remove fluoridation from their water supply. Despite the fact that 200 million people drink it every day. There's a massive body of evidence that it proves beneficial with no harm. And yet you see these kind of, this is slightly out of date data, but you see these pockets of resistance still in states like Oregon, where you wouldn't necessarily assume that people are hostile, but also in Florida. There have been communities in Florida the last few years that have voted to remove fluoride from the water supply. So my point is, I guess it's not always entirely rational. And that social aspect, when science comes along with its rationality, they're speaking two different languages. And I was reminded this, and I learned this firsthand a few years ago when I was at Wired, and I put on the cover a story about vaccines and vaccine risk. And in particular, it was a profile of Paul Offit, Dr. Paul Offit, the great hero of vaccines. I'm sure everyone on this call knows of Dr. Offit and the work he's done, not just developing vaccines, but also the reason we wrote the story about him was because he was willing to engage in combat, right? Take on the armies of doubt and skepticism and go to battle. And every day he is willing to wage arguments and be the person who is personally put himself out there. And so what we decided to do in this article, it came out in 2009, was to really just make use Dr. Offit's story to make a argument about how there is no evidence, and how even in the lack of evidence, the only weapon that people who argue for a link between vaccine and autism or other diseases, the only weapon they had was fear. So this is the story we did, and we tried to make the case. It developed, it was the article or the magazine sold a tremendous amount. It got a lot of publicity, a lot of attention. I'm not sure though that we convinced anybody. In fact, we got sued by anti-vaccine groups, and I think what we learned, and especially I learned these days, is rationality only gets you so far. Sooner or later, you have to win over hearts, and I think that's something that we in the public health community have not done enough of, and we have to get better at, is thinking about how can we convince people without just trying to argue with rationality. And this is something that again, just to say the obvious, we've seen this very vividly these past couple of years. In the 19th century, it was anti-vivisection and science getting mixed up with the politics of these new public health laws. Today, it's arguments over freedom and mask mandates. But there's clearly a highly social aspect to public health and science that we still are grappling with and trying to figure out. So that's the second. The third, and hoping to wrap this up soon. I think I have like 10 minutes left, if I'm correct. So the third point is that science is messy. And this is something I have learned repeatedly, but I think that the kind of messiness of the process and the messiness of both the scientific process as well as trying to implement science in the public domain through public health, it's a very messy process. Science is a constantly changing, evolving thing. It is really blundering its way towards a better understanding of some ground truth out there. And some best application of that science in a way that hopefully will resonate with the most possible people. But the process itself is constantly emerging. And I think, as we look back, yesterday's norms, the norms of public health and medicine, they often seem to our minds in 2022 barbaric or primitive or brutal to our modern senses. But I'll stipulate, or I'll bet, that today's practices and beliefs in science and medicine and public health will seem foolish and dangerous to some future version of society as well. So we're doing the best we can with the current understanding of science and how to apply it. But that is a process that will be improved upon. And so our best practices are somebody else's old-fashioned prospects. So a great example of this was just the kind of the frenzy, the mania that happened when Koch unveiled his remedy in 1890. So he, as I said, he announced it at this demonstration in Berlin. Arthur Conan Doyle could not get into the building. But he found somebody who told him what was happening inside, and he took feverish notes. So when he pronounced this remedy, it became the largest sensation in the world. Again, to state the obvious to this group, TB was the largest killer in the world, and to have some kind of cure set the world on fire. And so bizarrely, Koch's remedy was secret. He wouldn't tell anybody what was in this vial. But that didn't stop anybody from thinking that, this was the most respected scientist of the day. And so as his lab started to generate some tuberculin, it was called tuberculin, it set off what I believe, and if anybody has evidence to the contrary, please let me know. But I would stipulate that this was the largest mass human trial in history to date. As tuberculin was shipped around the world, it set off this frenzy of experimentation without rules. It was very messy. As you can see, there was no randomized controlled trials here. There were no IRBs here. The doses were wildly different. Some people would get a tiny amount. Some people would get massive doses. As you can see, this is this kind of sequence of illustrations that appeared in periodicals across the world of the remedy being tested. And so in contrast to Koch's reputation in the laboratory, his rigor, his process, his structure, his discipline, this experiment, again, the largest experiment in human history, was all over the place. The dosage was wildly different. It was going to children. It was going to infants. It was going to the elderly. It was going to people with profound TB. It was going to people with only newly diagnosed. And so I would call it nothing less than what to our modern eyes we would call horrific. Even to contemporarize it was. The director of the New York Bacteriological Institute said that we are assisting at the spectacle of one of the greatest medical and scientific delusions that has ever existed. So they recognized it in the moment that this was something was going on here that was out of their control. And then the results started to come in over the next few months, and I think it took a year or two, but the news wasn't good for Koch. There was a reaction, an immune reaction, but it was not curative. The disease would return. The bacteria was undaunted. The remedy, just to give away the plot, a spoiler, the remedy didn't work. So we had this mass experiment to a null effect, and so this messiness was all over us, and we were left with nothing. I think we can recognize the analogies. We're not out of this. We still kind of suffer through the same delusions just these last couple of years. Even now, science is full of failure and false hopes. This was a chart showing the clinical trials for hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and other therapies over the last couple of years. As I think everybody on this call would agree, these drugs have benefits, but not against COVID. And you can also look at the shifting signs of expert guidance that we've gotten over the past couple of years. The U.S. Surgeon General was tweeting, "Don't wear masks," and then all of a sudden it became very evident that we should wear masks. The virus was not airborne, and then it was airborne. And I think and that's how science works. I want to stipulate that I'm not faulting the public health community. I'm not faulting the researchers who are doing these trials. We should conduct science, but science is messy. It has to evolve. It has to emerge. It's a process. And I think having it happen so visibly, so in our face, on the news every day, has been for many a kind of cacophony. This kind of tumult of noise that unfortunately has been used against public health, has been used against medical science, has undermined, as you all know, has undermined at times the credibility of our already understaffed and underfunded and underappreciated public health system. So the messiness of science has in some ways, the process by which we all swear by and recognize is the best practice for understanding that ground truth, has been used against us. Now, a few years ago, I wrote a op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, kind of making this point. It was 2010, and I was trying to argue that this kind of always changing guidelines that medicine or public health authorities have in terms of like when should people get screened for mammograms? When do PSA tests work for prostate cancer detection? What foods is margarine okay? All of these kind of what seem like very obvious questions are actually emerging, right? That the science is always changing, and for many people in the public, it's frustrating, but that's how science works. So I tried to make that point in 2010. Frankly, nobody really cared. It was in the Wall Street Journal, and nobody really reacted to that op-ed. But today, the New York Times is making this point. They wrote a story very similar to what I argued a few years ago, that the whole country was getting a crash course in what they called scientific uncertainty, the kind of reckoning the process that happens here, and that for that in some sense that visibility, it's the opposite of invisibility. The visibility of science has really been I think something that that scientific community, the public health community, has not been prepared for. So we realize inside that this is how science works, this is how public health works, but it's not a pretty process. It is a messy process, and that we just have to reckon with the kind of the discomfort that is going to bring. because we want to provide answers. We want to provide guidance. That's what public health is all about. But we have to recognize that people are always going to be a little bit needing to be convinced, and sometimes convinced not through just rational argument. So I want to wind up. I just want to say that to most people, not you all, and Dr. Ervin actually made this point very clear, TB, to many people, TB sounds like some ancient malady, right? Like a relic from history, like the Black Plague. But TB, in fact, wasn't an ancient disease. In fact, in many ways, it was the first modern disease. It erupted with urbanization. It in many ways drove the emergence of modern medicine and modern public health. And so I hope I've persuaded you that public health is as noble as it is overlooked, that it drives innovation as it informs science, it protects society, and ultimately it comforts people. It makes us feel, public health makes us feel safer, more informed, more secure in living our daily lives and pursuing the stories that we want to tell through our lives. Those notions that there is a tomorrow, that our families will be safe. That's the story we all want to tell through our lives, and that's a story that we want to hear from public health. So that's my talk.
Thomas, thank you very, very, very much. And there's a lot of questions, a lot of discussions. I want to thank you personally for an outstanding talk. However, before we get to you, what I'd also like to do is, this is really a day of perspectives, and that we just wanted to kind of bring try our best to bring World TB Day home and as a perspective, especially for all of us who work in TB. And I'd like to today introduce Terry Chorba. We all know Terry from the CDC. And Terry has been kind enough to give some of his perspectives. As you may or may not be aware, Terry, every year on World TB Day, writes a little piece for the emerging infectious diseases. And we've asked Terry to give his perspective. And then we're going to be coming back. So please do me a favor. Two things. One, any questions you have, either write them in the questions and answers. We're going to try to address them. Write them in the chat or raise your hand. We'd rather hear from you, and we'll hear from you. But Terry, as you know, is a physician. His interest is in TB. It dates back to when he was 5 years old. And unfortunately, TB struck really close to home. His nanny was sent off to a sanatorium for pulmonary TB. When he first came to the CDC, he worked with Carol Posick, our dear friend, the TB program manager in South Carolina, on an outbreak of MDR TB in the North Carolina, South Carolina border, and later assisted in establishing a national TB reference laboratory in Kazakhstan after the breakup of the Soviet Union. For the past 12 years, he served as the chief of the field services branch of the CDC's Division of TB Elimination, which oversees the CDC's cooperative agreement for TB activities in the 50 states, territories, and the affiliated Pacific Islands. And for the last 8 years, he's provided, as I said, the Journal of Emerging Infectious Disease with a March cover article that ties some of the aspect of a work of art to the impact of the labors of Robert Koch. So Terry, we're so happy to have you. Thank you so, so much today for joining us, and thank you for sharing your perspective. Terry, I think you're mute. Yeah. You're still muted there, Terry. There you go, Terry. Hey, Terry.
Okay. Dave, thank you for your kind words. So, Thomas, I want to thank you very much for giving us all your poignant and fascinating reflections on the contributions and tribulations of Robert Koch, whose demonstration in 1882 of the cause of TB had a staggering impact on approaches to prevention of the disease, and where, as you say, the largest mass human trial to date was the efforts with tuberculin that that Koch fomented, I think the largest mass trial to date was a successful one, which was actually informing everyone that this was a communicable disease, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. I want to also thank you, Thomas, for writing Remedy, which I think is a superbly written book. It's a great read, and I'm recommending it to all my friends. I enjoyed every moment of it. So in the second half of the 19th century, when Koch made his announcement that Mycobacterium tuberculosis was the cause of TB, Europe was very rapidly urbanizing. There was mechanization of farm machinery, and there was the very fast development of factory production lines that drastically shifted European employment patterns and European populations. Rural areas were emptying out and cities were rapidly expanding, bringing people together in confined spaces where they could share airspace. And this was all before there was radiology or antibiotics, and it was all a perfect setting for the spread of pulmonary tract pathogens, including TB. Could I please have the collage page? There we go. Okay, so this is a page of the 8 covers of emerging infectious diseases that I've had the fun of writing. It's the journal historically was a journal that was a print journal. It's now all online, but they still put in a cover page. And I want to bring your attention to the one of the small child with the person lying in the bed behind them. You're all familiar with the scream that was done by Edvard Munch. Well, this is a portrait of that Edvard Munch did of himself back in his adulthood, looking back on how he perceived himself as a child at age 5 upon the death of his mother. This was in 1868, and his mother had just died from tuberculosis. And in that era, before Robert Koch, TB was still widely thought to be an inherited or a congenital disorder, as it ran in families. Although Edvard Munch had active pulmonary TB in his adolescent years, he had bouts of hemoptysis. He lived into his 80s, and he always pictured his family as inheriting both depression on his father's side of the family and tuberculosis on his mother's side of the family. And at the time of Munch's mother's death in Norway, close to 300 persons per 100,000 died on a yearly basis, either from pulmonary TB or for some progressive systemic disease that was thought to be TB. And but Norway itself was just representative of what was going on in the rest of Europe. Most deaths occurred among persons of childbearing age and from TB. And by 1900, after the techniques for performing diagnostic sputum smears were widely known in practice, the death rate from TB for women in the childbearing age group, the group 20 through 39 in Norway, was 415 per 100,000. That was a rise of 100 cases per 100,000 from 30 years before, which probably reflects both the fact that the urbanization was happening, but also that the diagnostic acumen had become better. But if you look at Norway and the rest of the developed world over the 50 years after 1900, the number of cases and deaths attributed to TB plummeted and kept plummeting long before we had the use of antibiotics. After Koch had demonstrated conclusively what was the causative organism, what followed was what Thomas told us earlier, is science is social. There were societal effects that were felt as a societal change of the perspective on TB and how to prevent it. Before Koch's discovery, there was this romanticist perspective that portrayed consumption as a tragic gift, inspiring creativity and productivity. In opera and in prose, heroes and heroines would hold forth with an earnest hope of recovery from TB despite overwhelming illness. And as Thomas mentioned in his book, there are well-known portrayals of the romanticist perspective on TB that many of you are familiar with. Alexander Dumas' La Dame aux Camélias, Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, Giuseppe Verdi's La Traviata, Giacomo Puccini's La Bohème. There was this idea, this romanticist vision of TB, but with the discoveries of Robert Koch, that vision was markedly diminished. By the end of the 19th century, a much more boring view came to dominate. That was that we needed environmental controls and social distancing, and those benefited the community by providing protection from it for TB, and for that matter, for other respiratory tract pathogens. And for persons who had access to isolation of sanatoriums and spas, the benefit of getting the infectious patient out of the community was as beneficial to the community as it was to the individual patients themselves. And the result was a dramatic decrease in cases of illness and death from TB several decades before we had effective antimicrobials come available. And in our warm-up for this show, Thomas volunteered a slide. Could I have the graph the graph slide? Okay, so this is a graph of mortality in New York City, and going across time, and you can see where 1882 comes along when Robert Koch makes his discovery, and after that you see these numbers come crashing down, and that is all before the antibiotic era. But you can see that in New York, the numbers were as high, similar to what I said of Norway. They're close to 400 deaths per 100,000. And if you look at our national figures, the numbers are similar as well nationally. In 1900, the reported mortality rate nationally was in excess of 200 deaths per 100,000. By 1921, because that's also going to include rural areas where you didn't have, well, you probably didn't have as good reporting, but you also didn't have the intensely shared airspaces. But by 1921, that number had come down to 100 deaths per 100,000. By 1938, it was down to 50 deaths per 100,000. And this was all before 1944. 1944 was the first time when we had any antibiotics used in humans, with PAS being first used in October and streptomycin being used in November of 1944. Isoniazid made its debut in 1951. Rifampin was first used in 1966. But despite the absence of such important pharmaceutical approaches, the numbers and cases of deaths continued to decline all the way, and that's all as the result of this magnificent revelation by Robert Koch. Dave, that would be the extent of my remarks here, but I do not want to relinquish the microphone without saying something about the looming specter of drug resistance, which when it occurs should be thought of as our stepping back into the pre-antibiotic era. Although, as I said, TB was romanticized in the literature and arts of the 19th century, a few studies from the pre-antimicrobial era enable us to estimate that without effective pharmaceutical treatment, the lifetime case fatality rate of smear-positive pulmonary TB was more than 70%. And today, globally, TB is responsible for approximately 10 million new cases of active TB and 1.5 million deaths annually, for a death rate more than 15%. But since the late 1980s, multi-drug resistant Mycobacterium tuberculosis has emerged principally in the developing world and in the former Soviet Union. And so the WHO numbers per year are about 400, a little more than 450,000 persons with incident MDR TB. And of them, only about 40% get enrolled in MDR TB treatment. So that means that there's about 250,000 cases of MDR TB that either don't get diagnosed or get diagnosed but do not get reported to national authorities. So that's where I think we need to maintain the pressure to expand testing and treatment of TB, drug susceptibility, and HIV, and get systematic provision of HIV treatment to develop a greater number and variety of antimicrobials and learn how to work with them, and to even reevaluate existing drugs for their anti-TB potential. Anyway, hats off to Robert Koch for his contributions on this, his special day, and to Thomas Goetz for giving us his fascinating and superbly written documentation of the ebb and flow of Koch's work at a time when so little was known about that tiny salmon-colored staining organism on the other side of the microscope lens. Back over to you, Dave.
Terry, thank you very, very, very much. And my hat's off to you, Terry. Thank you for all your leadership. Thank you for your insights. And most importantly, thank you for being my friend. Appreciate that very, very much. Somebody I can always turn to when I have a question or need help. So thank you very, very much. So we're gonna start to right now open it up for questions. You see here, if you have a question, please just either use the Q&A or raise your hand, and we'll call on you. And please, or the chat. We want to hear from you. I also want to introduce, as far as this, we're going to do a little panel here so we can go back and forth. You all know Rick. Ervin's going to join us, Terry, and I want to introduce my partner in crime, Connie Haley. Connie and I have been working together for the last couple of years, and I got to say, it's just a blast every day to work with her. And I'm really interested in Connie's insight. As always, when I started to tell Connie about what we were thinking about, the first thing she did was look at me with her usual Connie eyes and say, "You're kidding, right?" But I think Connie, I think you'd agree, unbelievable program. Connie, how you doing today?
Hi there. I'm doing great. Yeah, I think I was like, yes, this is a great idea.
I don't think you usually say that to me too often. I mean, so I think that was a novel. It was a different question. Hey, so I want to start, if it's okay. So Thomas, first of all, again, thank you. But I want to kind of make you switch hats for a second. So can you tell us a little about what you did with iodine and what you're doing with Good RX? Because I think it has a lot of pertinence to what we're going to be talking about in a little while, because I think the point you make is very, very strong, that, we need to change the perspectives. We need to find a way to get buy-in. And, I know you did a lot of work early on, with iodine, especially, where you were trying to come up with a way to give patients their health data in a better way and in a more digestible way, hopefully to motivate them towards disease. And I'm wondering, as you know where I'm going with this, like, I believe personally that TB has a major problem that most people don't know about TB. And I think the problem is that they don't view it as an issue or a problem. And if you don't view it as a problem, you're not going to do anything about it. And then the last thing is that, how do we change people's perspectives, or what would be your advice? So please, I'd like to give you a couple minutes to talk about your other hat.
Sure. Well, so I started Iodine in 2013 as a consumer website, and we built a couple apps. But really, it was a way to harness people's, to deliver better information to people, first of all, and we focused on medications, so prescription medications, and really trying to harness people's personal experience with medications and put that alongside the clinical evidence. So not trying to replace evidence, but trying to supplement it with experience. And so we created a database of hundreds of thousands of people's reported benefits or experience from medications. And we asked it in very plain language, like, was it worth it? Did you think this medication was worth it for any given condition or any given treatment? And we, as I said, we put that alongside, we had a great team of data engineers. My co-founder was from Google. And so we did all this extraction of FDA data sets and put it in the context of the clinical trials that we visualized in ways that hopefully people could understand and make sense of, lay people. And so, as I said, we sold it to GoodRx, and at GoodRx, where GoodRx is about, I think what it makes GoodRx remarkable is they make price something that which for many people is a factor in whether or not they're going to take a medication. Can they afford it? GoodRx makes that explicit and transparent. And so we've really combined the products inside GoodRx. And I guess it's the relevance to this community in this day would be, I think, just thinking about, as they say, the most effective medicine isn't worth anything if people don't take it. And I think that's been an especial challenge with TB. And with these long courses of treatment when people don't necessarily perceive a benefit months after months, and creating other incentives or other externalities that let them chart progress towards a goal. In the case of TB, it's a curative goal, but oftentimes for these chronic medications, the challenge is you don't perceive high cholesterol, and if you're taking a statin for the rest of your life, the goal is kind of kind of an abstraction, a number, a value that people. Well, as I say, it's not necessarily kind of this intrinsic motivation. So thinking about that, I mean, a lot of what I think about, and I saw some great, wonderful remarks from the group about behavior change and how the challenges of behavior change when it comes to healthcare. That is, I don't have the secrets, I don't have the solutions, but I am a student of that. And I think thinking about external motivations, intrinsic motivations, thinking about making things visible that you can kind of benchmark against in a kind of feedback loop. All of those are mechanisms that I think are that help us be more effective at driving behavior change. The last thing I'll say though is the thing that we really have to get better at is not putting the onus on the individuals to change their behavior and saying, look, here's the evidence. You go now and use this app and it's up to you. when the entire context, it goes back to the social thing, when our entire context of society is giving us distractions and reasons to not follow courses of therapy, et cetera. So we need to think about working, I think, not just through healthcare or not just through an app, but thinking, creating much more holistic solutions that make the best choice the default choice or the easier choice.
No, I totally agree. And just to further that, and then I will, but John Walkington is saying, and I agree, I mean, that one of the things that we're up against is social media. And it's not against, I mean, social media is a powerful tool. And I mean, it's changing the way we do everything. But the issue is, like you said, which I think is really important, is, and I don't think we talk enough about, science is messy. Like social media a lot of times is black or white. You're on one side or the other. I don't think social media does as well with the grays, And the problem is that at this point is that like you're getting conflicting messaging, And I love what you said about science is messy. And I think the people want to know, is it airborne spread or not? Do you need a mask or not? And I think that was not any different than what was happening with Koch and stuff. There was the two fractions. There was that cult of personality where people wanted to do Koch or Verschow, was it, or, yes or no. And now with social media, I think it's gotten really, really messy. How do we take something that's naturally messy and somehow clean it up and present it so it doesn't look like people don't know what they're doing, but realizing that there's a little bit of gray in everything?
Yeah. Well, so again, no easy answer. I agree. Social media is a huge challenge for efficient and effective and compelling communication on health issues. I wrestle with social media in my own life and in my family. I will say though that the 19th century had its own version of social media. It was an explosion of publishing, of popular press on a level unprecedented. There was so much popular media being put out that there were these, just thinking about England, for instance, there were these things called reviews that were basically Reader's Digest, right? They would take snippets from other publications and turn it into a review. And then there was this thing called review of reviews. So there was this top level, it was like retweeting, right? Or kind of something going viral was when it would work its way up the chain of publication to reviews to reviews of reviews. So it's the same phenomenon. It's just in that case, it's a slower technology, but it's the same phenomenon, which is we are, as humans, we have this urge to communicate ideas and opinions, and some of them are based in fact and some of them are not. And I think we need to make sure we're responsible how we use those tools and these technologies for distribution, but we also need to make sure that we're thinking about how can we make our facts as compelling as the spurious information.
What I find, I'm looking at the chat, and what I'm finding really interesting, and over like individuals like Deborah and stuff are saying, that it's all about trust. It's about heart. And that is public health. I mean, the reason all of us went into medicine and then even further public health is that trust and that heart, that sense of we really do care. And I think, that is the balance. Like, how do you, like you said, be honest in what we know and what we don't know, but at the same time gain trust? And I want to just acknowledge all my public health people out there. Go ahead, Tom, and then I think Connie.
No, Connie.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
pointing to Connie.
I was about to say, Connie, go ahead. Please.
Hey. Well, first of all, thank you so much. I loved the book. I really enjoyed this presentation, and I actually really went back and listened to your TED Talk too, and thought it was fabulous. And I'm a fellow Wahoo, go UVA, and I majored in psychology. So all of this that you're talking about with behavior change really resonates with me. But if I may go to your book and read a passage on page 117, this is another theme that really resonated with me, and I think ties into the three that you've talked about. The laboratory is a long way from the doctor's office. This was true in the 19th century, and it's true in the early 21st. It is the rare physician who can keep track of the torrent of new medical research, and it's even less common to find one who manages to integrate that information into the care he delivers in his office day in, day out. And you went on to say, recent research bears this out. In 2000, two data scientists from the University of Missouri, E. Andrew Ballas and Susan A. Warren, measured the lag from the lab to the doctor's office by analyzing a handful of common clinical procedures such as mammograms, cholesterol screenings, and flu vaccines. They then tracked when the breakthrough was first discovered and worked their way forward through peer-reviewed publication in textbooks and to widespread implementation. The question was, how long did it take? 2 years, 5 years, a decade? And I had seen this fact before. It took 17 years. And I've long been fascinated in translating research into practice, that publications aren't just put on the shelf. And you wove it in when you're talking about Conan Doyle and how he would use science into action in solving his crimes. And you talked about it in your TED Talk about how, the facts of your own human behavior can be implemented into action to behavior change. And you certainly talked about Koch and Pasteur and how their discoveries being translated into action were so relevant. And I think even today that ties in so well with, there's so much discovery that even those who are experts can't keep track of it. And yet many people do research and discovery. And if it's not built in that those discoveries are translated into an action that gets into the frontline practice, it may or may not, have an uptake and change and improve, the public's health as well. And I'm just was thrilled to see that and fascinated and seeing how it ties into the messiness. And, even Koch got into some trouble trying to implement what he thought was this action into a remedy when it wasn't, he didn't follow his own process. So that tension between, early implementation and putting something into action with, it's still messy and we may not still know exactly the full benefit of it, is really something we struggle with as providers, I think, and people out there trying to improve public health. So what comments do you have around that? And, do you have solutions yet? Maybe through your company?
I don't have solutions. I agree. I think, and that 17 years is to me, it's really very close to a generation. Right. And so what we're talking about in many ways is there's this kind of generational phase change that happens that is kind of dispiriting, but what we're sometimes waiting for is a new generation of practitioners to bring in what they've learned. Many people, especially on this call, are still engaged in the literature and still working on it. And thinking about how they can improve their practice, but that's not necessarily universal. I think I definitely don't have any answers. I think one of the things that I am struggling with over this last couple of years is how how so many people are in the face of clear evidence and benefit, such as vaccines, are making decisions that are very clearly antithetical to their health and to the health of their families. And I can't quite fathom how that seems so divorced from the world that I live in and the belief system that I have, that I just haven't reckoned with it. And I think we still, we talk about social media, but we haven't reckoned with the scale of, or the ability of our fellow countrymen and our neighbors to just deny what we might present to them as clear and tangible benefit to their livelihood, their lives, and their families' lives. And usually those things have been compelling, and somehow they're not.
One thought, I'll let you move on to another question, but one other follow-up to that is, watching all of this unravel in the last couple of years with COVID and the health messaging, and it was messy, but I think maybe personally, I feel like we are often in public health very good at weighing risks and benefits, personal and public. And in admitting what we don't know and what's messy. And I think that sometimes maybe that makes it easier to understand this is what we know right now. And I didn't think all the messaging, and then when you throw in misinformation and the echo chambers from social media and news, I just think things got really polarized. And it's so unfortunate because perhaps if we'd come right out and said, this is what we know right now, we really think this is going to help you and your others, weigh your risks and benefits, mask wearing, what's the downside, although you could argue with young children, but, we know more now. But I think that's one thing that public health people are taught is how to weigh risks and benefits and sort of weigh out, what to do.
One thing I'm gonna contradict what I just said before, because I think you made a very good point. I want to just applaud everyone on this call for the success that public health has made and the lives that public health has saved over the past 2 years. Right? It is a remarkable triumph and historic triumph of healthcare. The vaccines development was great. That was a miracle of medicine, but getting it into people's arms was the challenge, and public health rose to that challenge and succeeded. And so, yes, there's this percentage of people who I think I just made the error of giving them outsized representation, because that is not that is not at all the kind of majority effect of public health. And so I think what you say about uncertainty is exactly right. I've spent a lot of my my efforts in technology and information in trying to visualize uncertainty and trying to acknowledge uncertainty in medicine. And I think that is one of the most important things we can do is to acknowledge, okay, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, here's our level of confidence, and that helps people navigate their own decisions.
Thomas, I want to thank you. And on that, I want to share your sentiment. We really do thank everybody out there. I mean, I agree with you. The countless numbers of individuals who've been affected and saved by public health. I mean, that is the sentiment of today. I have to, because of time, I just want to give you Deborah White's comment. I love it. It says, thank you for a great book. Wonder if you've been writing about the current pandemic. So they already want an encore, Any thoughts of another book or what?
There are too many books out there about this pandemic. They don't need my mind added to the stack.
Well, I want to thank you personally. I want to say you really got a lot of discussions. Alan Wyman, I mean, he's lighting it up, and I appreciate it. I want to we don't have enough time to deal, but his points are great, and so is everybody else's. And with that, I want to thank everybody for today. I want to, say that what today is all about is just remember that we wanted to kind of take a break from what we do every day and remind everybody about the famous quote that the only history that's new in the world, the only things that are new in the world is the history you don't know. And that was Truman, and it's true. And it's really important on this day to, first of all, remember where we've been, because this really is the path for where we have to be. And most importantly, remember all of the millions and millions of people who have died of this disease, all the hundreds of thousands who are suffering, and hopefully the prayer for maybe one day we won't have to worry about this anymore. So again, thank you from all of us at the Southeast National TB Center, from all of us from on the panels, and all of you who've contributed today. Please, thank you very much. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you soon. And Karen, I'm turning it back over to you.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you all of our participants who've stayed on and joined us for today's webinar. We hope that you enjoyed this opportunity to peek into our past and apply lessons learned to today's effort to eliminate TB. Special thanks to our guest, Thomas Goetz. Thank you so much. Also to Rick Ervin, Terry, thank you so very much. Dave, another great job facilitating. Much appreciated. We welcome your feedback on today's webinar. We'll place the link to the evaluation in chat right now, and we'll also send you an email following this event. So if you'll take a few moments to take the few short questions to give us some feedback. We'd appreciate it. And before we close, I just want to say a few words, take a few moments to recognize the loss of one of our very own in our TB family, the renowned humanitarian and global health advocate, Dr. Paul Farmer. He's remembered for dedicating his life to improving healthcare in the world's underserved communities. He's remembered for being a strong advocate for health equity and social justice, and he co-founded the global public health organization, Partners in Health. May his work and the work that all of you do in TB continue on long into the future. We dedicate today's webinar to all who have died from TB, those who are infected with TB, and to those who work tirelessly to achieve TB elimination. Thank you, everyone. Hats off to you on World TB Day, and we'll see you again next year.